Long years ago, when the coast of America was still wild with fog, pine forests, and lonely harbors lit by whale oil lamps, sailors told stories that decent folk refused to repeat after dark. They spoke of reefs that rose like teeth from black water, of lanterns seen burning on empty shores, and of ships that returned with no living soul aboard. But among all the tales whispered from Boston to Charleston, from the rocky coast of Maine down to the swamps of the South, none was spoken of with more fear than the story of the Mercy of Salem, a merchant brig that vanished in a storm and left behind a sound no man who heard it ever forgot. It was not the creaking of timber, not the groaning of the mast, not the rush of the sea against the hull. It was the sound of men crying beneath the deck, and it began in the autumn of 1798. The Mercy of Salem was a proud ship in her day, 2 masts, a black hull, and a figurehead carved in the shape of a woman with folded hands, as though praying to be spared from the sea. She sailed out of Massachusetts with cargo packed tight in her belly, barrels of lamp oil, crates of iron tools, bolts of wool, tobacco, dried cod, and sometimes passengers who could not afford better passage. Captain Elias Vane commanded her. He was a tall, severe man of 49, with a weather-cut face and pale eyes that made young deckhands lower their gaze. He had spent nearly his whole life on the water and believed in 2 things only: discipline and providence. He feared God in the daylight and feared the ocean in private, though he never admitted the second aloud. His first mate was Josiah Reed, broad-shouldered and loyal, a man who had once been a fisherman in Gloucester before a winter storm took both his brothers. There was all in your action, the carpenter, Silas Morrow, the cook, Thomas Bell. In those days, a voyage along the American coast could be as dangerous as crossing an ocean. Storms came hard and sudden, sandbars shifted, charts lied, and at night the sea seemed to think for itself. Still, the Mercy of Salem had a good record. She had made many successful runs carrying goods between New England ports and farther south. Men said she was lucky. That luck ended in October. The ship departed Salem Harbor under a sky the color of old pewter. The air smelled of rain and salt, and gulls circled low over the rigging, shrieking as if warning the men below. Captain Vane had orders to bring the cargo southward and return before winter tightened its grip. It should have been a routine voyage. But from the first day, there was something wrong aboard the Mercy. It began with the cabin boy. Young Thomas Bell slept in a narrow berth near the aft passage, not far from the captain's cabin. On the second night at sea, he came running to the galley, pale as chalk, his hands shaking so hard he spilled the tin cup he carried. Silas Morrow, the cook, barked at him for making a mess, but the boy could barely speak. "There's someone crying below," Thomas whispered. Silas frowned. "Below where?" "In the lower cabin, past the stores. I heard it through the floorboards." The cook laughed, though uneasily. "You heard the sea in the hull, that's all." Thomas shook his head at once. "No, sir. It sounded like a man, like he was trying not to cry too loud." Silas cuffed him lightly on the shoulder and told him to stop filling his head with foolishness. Yet when the boy refused to sleep alone, Silas let him curl up beside the galley fire. By morning, the story had spread. The sailors mocked Thomas, of course. They called him Church Bell, Ghost Boy, Milk Heart. But mockery is often just fear dressed up in a louder voice, and more than one man glanced toward the hatch leading below deck when the wind dropped and the ship fell quiet. That evening, First Mate Reed searched the lower cabin himself. There was nothing there, only stacked provisions, damp boards, and the lantern glow trembling on the walls. No stowaway, no injured man, no reason for crying. Captain Vane ordered the matter forgotten. For 2 days it was. Then the storm came. It rose after sundown with no moon in the sky. Clouds gathered thick and low until sea and heavens became one great black shape pressing in from all sides. The wind struck first in sudden fists, snapping the canvas and setting the masts to moaning. Rain followed in hard silver sheets. "Reef the topsails!" Captain Vane shouted over the gale. Men scrambled like shadows through the rigging. The deck pitched beneath them. Water crashed over the rails and ran in freezing rivers across the planks. Thunder rolled so close, it seemed to shake the nails from the ship. The Mercy of Salem fought like a living thing. She climbed black waves only to plunge into troughs so deep the sky vanished above her. The lanterns swung madly. The cook's pots shattered in the galley. Somewhere below deck, cargo broke loose and slammed against its restraints with a sound like cannon fire. Then, in the middle of that chaos, Thomas Bell screamed. Several men turned. The boy stood at the hatch to the lower cabin, white-faced, one hand gripping the frame. "They're crying again," he shouted. "Can't you hear them?" At first no one understood what he meant. Then, between the roar of the storm and the crash of the sea, a strange sound rose from below. Not a groan of timber, not a whine of wind, a voice, then another, low, muffled, broken by sobs, men crying. Some of the sailors froze where they stood. One crossed himself. Another cursed and spat into the storm. Josiah Reed rushed to the hatch and yanked it open, but a rush of seawater from the deck nearly threw him down the steps. The sound came again. From deep in the ship, not one voice now, but several, overlapping, weak, desperate, and wet, as if the mouths making them were full of seawater. Captain Vane heard it too. Every man saw the captain's face change, only for an instant, but it changed. His pale eyes widened with a fear so naked that the whole deck felt it. "Shut that hatch," he roared. "Sir," Reed began. "Shut it," Reed obeyed, slamming the hatch closed. The storm worsened. Near midnight, a wave taller than the mast struck the Mercy broadside. The ship rolled so violently that one sailor was swept overboard without even time to cry out. Another broke his leg against the capstan. The mainmast split with a cracking report and leaned drunkenly over the deck, rigging whipping in the dark. Water flooded the hold. The pumps were manned, but the sea was coming in faster than the men could force it out. Captain Vane gave the order no sailor ever wished to hear: abandon her. But there were too few boats, and the storm was too fierce. One lifeboat smashed before it touched water. Another overturned at once. The men clung to anything they could: lines, broken spars, each other, but the Atlantic showed no mercy. And beneath the thunder, beneath the screaming wind, beneath the splintering death of the ship, those voices below deck kept crying. The Mercy of Salem vanished before dawn. No one saw her sink. The storm swallowed ship and crew alike. By sunrise, there was nothing left on the water but wreckage: a barrel, a torn sail, and the body of the cabin boy drifting face down in the foam. That should have been the end of it. But the sea, especially along the old American coast, has never been good at keeping the dead. 3 weeks later, a fishing smack out of Marblehead spotted the Mercy of Salem drifting in a bank of morning fog. The men aboard the fishing vessel nearly rammed her before they realized what they were seeing. A black brig with torn rigging, half her sails gone, one mast snapped, hull scarred and listing but still afloat. No flag flew. No man stood at the rail. She drifted silently as a coffin. The fishermen hailed her. No answer. They came alongside with great reluctance, calling again and again into the white stillness. At last one of them, an old sailor named Eben Shaw, climbed aboard with a boat hook in one hand and a lantern in the other. He found the deck deserted. There were signs of panic everywhere: ropes cut in haste, splintered wood, blood washed thin across the planks, and one shoe caught beneath the rail. The captain's wheel turned a little in the wind, though no hand touched it. The fishermen searched the upper deck and captain's cabin first. No bodies, no survivors, only damp blankets, a Bible swollen with seawater, a shattered lamp, and a silver watch stopped at 12 minutes past 2. Eben Shaw later swore that from the moment he set foot on the ship, he felt he was intruding upon something that had not finished happening. The air aboard the Mercy was wrong. Too cold, too still, and every sound, the slap of water, the tap of loose rope against mast, even his own breathing seemed swallowed up by the hull, as if the ship were listening. "Check below," one of the fishermen called from the hatch. Aben did not want to. Still, he lifted the lantern and descended. The lower passage smelled of wet wood, salt, and something else faint but foul, like stagnant bilge left too long in the heat. He found crates smashed open, provisions spoiled, and seawater pooled black on the floor. But no bodies, no rats even, no sign that anyone had survived long enough to hide. Then he reached the cabin near the stern, the one where spare charts, tools, and sometimes crew bedding were kept during rough weather. The door stood half open. Eben raised the lantern. Inside, on the floor, he saw deep grooves cut into the wood, not from cargo, not from tools. They were marks made by fingernails, dozens of them, long frantic scrapes crossing one another, concentrated near the walls and under the bunks, as though several men had clawed the floor in terror. And in the far corner, where the lantern light barely reached, the boards were darkened with old water stains. Or blood. Eben backed out at once. He said nothing until he was safely back aboard the fishing smack. The Mercy of Salem was towed into harbor by afternoon, and by evening half the town had gathered at the docks to stare. The official story was simple enough. Storm wreck. All hands lost. Ship miraculously found adrift. The cargo that remained would be inventoried. The vessel might even be repaired and sold. But sailors talk. Within a day, word spread that strange marks had been found in the lower cabin. By the second day, men were saying they'd heard sounds from inside the hull after sunset. By the third day, no one would stay on the ship alone. Still, ships were expensive, and grief was no match for commerce. A Boston trading concern purchased the Mercy for a low price, changed her name to the Providence Star, repaired what they could, repainted the hull, and hired a fresh crew. It was said that a new name could break bad luck. Some believed it, others knew better. The new captain was a younger man called Nathaniel Crow. He had no patience for superstition and less for drunken dockside tales. When warned that the Providence Star had once been the Mercy of Salem, and that men claimed to hear crying from the lower cabin, he laughed openly. "Then I'll tell the ghosts to help with the sails," he said. His first voyage aboard the ship began in late November with 9 crewmen, a modest cargo, and enough confidence to fill every inch of the hold. The first week passed without incident. The men settled into routine. The ship, though scarred by the storm that had nearly killed her, handled the sea well enough. Captain Crow boasted in his log that the old stories were the nonsense of shore-bound cowards. Then on the 8th night, just after midnight, the youngest sailor aboard Matthew Hobb, age 17, came running up from below deck, sobbing so hard he could barely stand. "There's a man in the cabin," he gasped. Captain Crow, irritated and half awake, demanded an explanation. Matthew pointed toward the hatch with a trembling hand. "He's below, sir, in the stern cabin. I heard him crying, and when I opened the door, I swear to God there was someone kneeling in the dark." The crew muttered. One man refused to go below at all. Another seized a lantern and a knife. Crow, red-faced with anger, led the search himself. They found nothing. No stowaway. No intruder. No wet footprints. No kneeling man. Captain Crow nearly struck the boy for frightening the crew, but the next night, 2 more sailors heard it. Not a voice from outside the ship, not the sound of waves in the timbers. A man crying somewhere in the lower cabin, low and hopeless, with the breathless, choking rhythm of someone trying to swallow grief and failing. This time Crow heard it too. He stood at the top of the steps with his lantern held high, every man behind him silent. The crying went on for nearly a minute. Then it stopped all at once. Crow descended alone. The lower passage was empty. He checked the stern cabin. Nothing. Yet when he turned to leave, he noticed that the floorboards in the far corner were wet. Not with seawater, with little puddles, as if water had dripped from clothing or hair. He touched the boards. The water was ice cold. He said nothing to the crew, but from that night onward, he kept a pistol in his belt and avoided the lower cabin after dark. The first death aboard the Providence Star came 2 nights later. A sailor named Hugh Larkin failed to report for the dawn watch. He was found in the lower passage, sprawled at the foot of the steps with his neck broken. It might have been an accident, except for one thing. His hands were raw to the bone. Both palms and fingers had been scraped bloody, as though he had clawed desperately at the floor while being dragged. Captain Crow ordered the body wrapped and committed to the sea before noon. No prayers were spoken. The crew was already fraying. Men whispered together in corners, jumped at every groan of the hull, and refused to go below deck alone. Matthew Hobb, the youngest, swore he saw a wet figure pass the galley door at dusk. Another man claimed he woke to find seawater dripping from the ceiling onto his face, though the weather was clear and the deck above dry. Then came the smell. It began near the stern cabin and spread slowly through the lower passage, a briny, rotten odor like seaweed left on a corpse. The carpenter inspected the bilge and found nothing wrong. The boards were sound. No dead animal had been trapped. No spoilage explained it. Yet every evening the smell returned, and with it the crying, always after midnight, always from below, sometimes one voice, sometimes many. Once, Matthew Hobb covered his ears and screamed that he could hear words mixed in with the sobbing. "Open the door," he said. "They keep saying, 'Open the door.'" Captain Crow struck him across the face for that, but the captain's own hands shook when he did it. At last Crow decided the stern cabin must be cleared out and resealed. He ordered 2 men to empty it by daylight. Inside they found little of note: spare rope, a cracked chest, damp blankets, rusted lantern hooks, and old stains in the floorboards that no scrubbing could lighten. Yet beneath one bunk, wedged into the narrow gap between timber and wall, the carpenter found something wrapped in sailcloth. It was Captain Elias Vane's logbook from the final voyage of the Mercy of Salem. The pages were swollen, but many remained legible. Crow read them alone in his cabin that evening. At first the entries were ordinary: weather reports, cargo tallies, notes on crew conduct. Then the tone changed. The final week's entries were written in a hurried, jagged hand. October 9. Boy reports weeping below. No cause found. Reed says it is imagination. October 10. Bell heard it again. Pike also reports noise in lower stern cabin. I inspected personally. Found nothing but dampness. October 11. Morrow refuses night watch near stern. Claims someone whispered through the door. Crew unsettled. October 12. I have forbidden mention of it. Tonight I myself heard crying from below. Reed heard also. It ceased when hatch opened. October 13. Strange water in cabin, though hull appears sound. Thomas Bell says there are men behind the walls. I rebuked him. God forgive me, I fear the boy believes it. October 14. Storm rising. I have remembered something I should not have forgotten. There the writing changed, growing more frantic. We took on a passenger in Gloucester last winter, a sailor called Abram Vale, half frozen and begging passage south. He was fevered, raving, and violent by the second day. Reed said we should put him ashore at once, but weather held us from port. On the third night he attacked Bell with a knife. The crew subdued him. I ordered him confined in the stern cabin until we reached land. The storm delayed us 3 days. We had little fresh water. The man howled, beat at the door, and swore he heard his drowned brothers calling him from under the sea. On the 4th night his cries ceased. When Reed opened the cabin, Vale was dead, whether by fever or thirst I do not know. The men wanted his body overboard at once, but the sea was rough and night black. We wrapped him in canvas and left him until morning. By morning the body was gone. The canvas remained. The door was still barred from outside. Captain Crow stopped reading there for some time. When he resumed, the final entries had become nearly illegible. I hear him in the cabin, not Vale alone. Others with him. Reed says it is guilt. Pike says it is the sea wanting payment. Bell cries every night, God help us. The voices know our names. They are beneath the floor. They beg to be let out. Reed opened the cabin, though I forbade it. He says there are men inside, all wet, all looking at the wall. He will not speak further. Storm. Water rising. They are crying in the dark. Bell says the dead are still locked in. The final line, scratched so deeply the nib tore the paper, read, Do not open the cabin if they begin to knock. Captain Crow closed the book. At that exact moment, 3 heavy knocks sounded from below his feet. From the stern cabin. Crow later claimed he did not go below out of bravery, but because terror leaves a man with only 2 choices: face it or let it devour him while he waits. He took the lantern and the pistol and descended alone. The lower passage was empty, but from behind the stern cabin door came a soft, wet sound. Not crying, scratching, slow, patient scratching, like fingernails drawn across wood. Crow raised the lantern. The door was shut. He could hear breathing on the other side. More than one set of lungs. He backed away and called for the crew. No one wanted to come, but fear of the captain still outweighed fear of the cabin. 6 men joined him at the hatch, armed with belaying pins, knives, and 1 rusted boarding axe. The scratching had stopped. Crow held up Vane's logbook and told them what he had found. No one spoke when he finished. At last the carpenter muttered, If a man died in there and wasn't given proper rest, maybe he's not all that's left. Superstitious filth, Crow snapped, though without conviction. What's your order, sir? Asked the mate. Crow stared at the cabin door. Then, against the warning written by a dead captain's hand, he said, Open it. The carpenter protested at once. Matthew Hobb began to cry, but Crow had already stepped forward. He drew back the bolt. The door swung inward. The lantern light spilled across the empty room. For a moment it seemed the whole ordeal had been madness. There was nothing inside but damp wood, 2 bunks, and the old corner stains. Then the smell struck them so foul and sudden that 1 sailor vomited in the passage. The lantern flame guttered, and from the far wall came the sound of someone exhaling. Crow turned. The boards of the wall were bulging outward. Not much, just enough to notice, as if pressure from the other side were slowly pushing through. Then came the first cry, a low, broken sob from within the wall itself. Another answered it, then another. The sound rose all around them, behind the boards, under the floor, inside the timbers, dozens of men weeping in the dark. Matthew Hobbs screamed and fled up the stairs. 1 sailor dropped his lantern and ran after him. Another fell to his knees, praying. Crow stood frozen as the wall began to tremble. Something thumped against it from within. Once, twice. Then the entire panel cracked down the middle. A hand came through. It was not a living hand. The skin was gray-white and swollen with seawater. The fingernails were split and bloody at the quick. Barnacles clung to the wrist. Water streamed from it in steady black drops as it groped blindly into the cabin. Then another hand burst through beside it, and another. The wall split apart. The men inside were still wearing sailors' clothes, though rotten and hanging in strips from their bodies. Their faces were bloated, eyes milk-white, mouths open too wide as seawater poured from them. Some had broken necks. Some were missing patches of flesh. 1 still had a length of rope twisted around his throat. Captain Crow recognized none of them, but they all wore the look of men who had died terrified. They were the crew of the Mercy of Salem, or what remained of them. And among them, pushing slowly through the broken wall with his head bent and shoulders twitching as though still sobbing, came Captain Elias Vane. His face was pale as drowned wax. 1 side of his skull was caved in. His beard drifted with water that should not have been there. Yet His eyes were open. He looked at Crow and whispered in a voice full of the sea, "We never left the cabin." Then the dead fell upon them. What happened next was pieced together later from the survivors, though neither man lived long enough to tell it twice the same way. The dead did not move quickly. That was the worst of it. They advanced with a slow certainty, hands reaching, heads jerking, mouths leaking salt water and sobs. They did not need speed. Panic did the rest. One sailor swung the boarding axe and buried it in a corpse's shoulder. The thing barely noticed. Another tried to force past them in the passage and was dragged down screaming. His face smashed against the boards until his teeth broke loose. Crow fired his pistol into Elias Vane's chest. The shot blasted a hole through coat and bone. Vane staggered back a step, then came on as if nothing had happened. The lantern went out. Darkness swallowed the cabin. Men fought blind in a space full of wet hands and crying voices. Some fled upward. Some never reached the hatch. The ship rang with screams, boots pounding on stairs, bodies slamming into walls. Above deck, the night had turned deathly still. No wind, no rain, no waves worth speaking of. Only the sound from below, crying, choking, and the splinter of wood breaking under force. Matthew Hobb and one other sailor, a man named Daniel Sykes, managed to launch the longboat. They did it half mad with terror, cutting the ropes with numb hands while something heavy thudded through the deck behind them. Captain Crow emerged only moments before the longboat pushed off. His coat was torn, his face bloodied, and his left hand hung at a terrible angle. He tried to leap into the boat but missed, striking the side and nearly overturning it. Daniel hauled him in by the collar. As the three survivors drifted away, they looked back at the Providence Star. Figures stood along the rail, not living men, wet silhouettes, unmoving, faces turned toward the boat. One of them was small and thin, the shape of a cabin boy. Another wore the remains of a captain's coat. All of them were crying. The sound carried over the black water until dawn. By the time a passing vessel found the longboat the next morning, Matthew Hobb had gone mute. Daniel Sykes would not stop praying. Captain Crow died of fever 2 days later, though the ship's surgeon swore his wounds were not enough to kill him. Before Crow died, he clutched the surgeon's sleeve and whispered one sentence. They were locked in alive. No one knew what he meant. Not then, but years later, when the last pieces of the story came together, people understood, and they wished they had not. The Providence Star was lost after that. No harbor saw her return. No wreck was found, yet the legend spread. And like all true horrors, it grew not because people embellished it, but because enough of it could be proven to make the impossible feel dangerously close. Captain Elias Vane's widow came forward with letters. In one written months before the Mercy's last voyage, Vane confessed privately to a grave error at sea that had troubled his conscience. He never named it, but he wrote that he feared the Lord may yet hear what was shut behind that cabin door. A surviving fisherman from Gloucester remembered Abram Vale, the fevered passenger mentioned in the logbook. He confirmed that Vale had boarded the Mercy half dead, raving that the sea spoke to him in the voices of drowned sailors. But the fisherman also claimed something stranger. Vale had not been alone when he arrived at the docks. He had been found beside the wreck of a smaller coastal sloop that had gone down in winter ice with 6 men aboard. Vale was the only one pulled from the water alive, or thought to be alive. The town doctor who examined him wrote in his notes that Vale's pulse was weak to the point of absence, and his skin cold as harbor stones. He had muttered only one coherent sentence before being taken away. They're still in the cabin. No one knew what cabin he meant. Not until the rest came to light. An old shipwright from Salem, already in his 80s when he gave his account, claimed he had repaired the Mercy after a minor collision the year before she sank. During that repair, Captain Vane asked for something unusual. The stern cabin wall was to be reinforced and partially rebuilt. When asked why, Vane answered only that some boards had been damaged. The shipwright did as ordered. Years later, When shown the surviving plans of the ship, he pointed to the very wall from which the drowned sailors had emerged aboard the Providence Star. There was dead space behind it, a narrow crawl space between outer hull and inner cabin wall, too small for comfort, too small for a man to survive in, unless he had been put there and forgotten. The final truth, as much as any mortal can claim to know the truth of such things, came from Daniel Sykes, the sailor who escaped the Providence Star in the longboat. He lived only 6 months after the voyage. Drink ruined what fear did not. He woke screaming almost every night, swearing the sound of crying had followed him inland and now seeped from the walls of his boarding room whenever rain struck the windows. At last, very near death, he told the minister everything he believed had happened. This was his account. Captain Elias Vane had not locked only Abram Vale in that stern cabin during the Mercy's earlier winter voyage. There had been a sickness aboard, then some fever from a northern port, carried by 3 sailors who soon took ill. They raved, coughed blood, and frightened the rest of the crew. Fearing contagion, Vane ordered them confined together in the stern cabin with Vale, who was already delirious and violent. The storm that followed lasted longer than expected. Food and water ran short. The men in the cabin begged to be let out. They pounded and screamed and wept. Some crewmen wanted to free them. Others feared the sickness. Vane, proud and stubborn, insisted the quarantine remain until they reached shore. But they never reached shore in time. When at last the door was opened, the cabin was empty. Not because the men had vanished, because in their desperation they had torn at the weakened boards, crawled into the narrow dead space behind the wall, and died there, one atop another in the dark, trapped between timber and hull while the ship sailed on. No burial, no prayers, no names entered properly in the record. Their bodies remained sealed inside the ship itself. And when the sea finally took the Mercy of Salem, Captain Vane and the rest of his crew drowned above the very men they had abandoned below. Some said the dead rose because of guilt. Some said because of the storm. Some said Abram Vale had brought something aboard from the wreck where he had been found, something old and patient that listened when dying men begged not to be forgotten. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. The cabin had not emptied. It had waited. You may think this is where the story ends. It does not, because ships, like houses, leave splinters of themselves behind. In 1821, more than 20 years after the loss of the Mercy of Salem, a storm washed part of a blackened ship's hull onto a beach near Cape Ann. The timber was old, worm-eaten, and strange with barnacle growth. Yet one piece still bore traces of painted lettering beneath salt and rock. A local boy scraped at it with a knife until he uncovered 3 faded letters. Mem El. The wreckage was hauled inland and broken apart for salvage. Some beams were burned. Others were reused in sheds, fences, and outbuildings along the coast. That winter, in a farmhouse near Ipswich, a family complained of noises in the walls after midnight. Soft knocking, weeping. The father tore open part of the pantry where one salvaged beam had been fitted into the frame. Inside the wall cavity, there was nothing at all, but the wood was wet to the touch. In another town, a cooper used a length of the recovered timber to mend the floor of his workshop. He later swore he heard crying beneath the planks whenever rain struck the roof, and once found little half-moon gouges in the wood as if nails had scraped from below. The strangest account came from a widow in Newburyport who purchased a sea chest built from salvaged shipboards. She kept letters and linens inside it. Every morning for a week, she found the chest standing open, though she had locked it each night. On the 8th night, she stayed awake to watch. Near 2 in the morning, she heard a sound from inside the chest, a man sobbing quietly. She sold it the next day for almost nothing and refused ever after to speak of what she had heard. By the middle of the century, the story of the Mercy of Salem had passed into legend. Sailors told it in taverns. Children dared one another to repeat it in dark lofts. Most believed only pieces of it. Some believed none at all. Yet every few years another report surfaced. A derelict vessel seen in fog, with a broken mast, and no lanterns burning. Crying heard from offshore, where no ship was visible. Wet footprints on an empty deck, and always, in the oldest versions of the tale, the warning remained the same. If you hear men weeping below deck, do not open the cabin door, because the dead of the Mercy do not cry for pity. They cry because they are still locked in the dark, and they want someone else inside with them. There is one last account, and it is the one that troubles me most. In 1874, an aging harbor clerk in Portland, Maine, wrote a statement in his ledger after an incident so odd that his superiors marked him unfit for service. The man's name was Gideon Marsh, and by all reports he was sober, meticulous, and not given to fancies. On a fog-bound evening in late November, a brig drifted into the outer harbor without signaling. She came in silently under almost no sail and nearly struck a moored schooner before the harbor men rowed out to intercept her. Gideon went with them. He later wrote that the ship looked old beyond reason, its hull black with salt, its rigging frayed, and its figurehead worn nearly smooth by weather. No name could be clearly read on the stern. The deck was wet, though the fog had not yet turned to rain. They called out. No answer. Gideon and 2 others climbed aboard. There was no crew on deck, no fresh cargo, no sign of recent life at all, except that a lantern near the wheel was burning with a weak yellow flame. That was impossible, he wrote, because the lantern's glass was thick with salt and the oil reservoir nearly dry, as if it had been burning for weeks. Then he heard it, crying, faint, below deck. One of the harbor men heard it too, and immediately ran back to the boat. The other refused to move, gripping his boat hook so tightly his knuckles went white. Gideon, who knew nothing of the Mercy tale at the time, took the lantern and descended alone. At the bottom of the steps he found a narrow passage and, at its end, a closed cabin door. The crying was behind it. Several voices, men trying not to sob loudly. He laid his hand on the latch, and from the other side, in a whisper so close it seemed to pass through the wood and into his skin, a voice said, "Captain, please, let us out." Gideon ran. All 3 men shoved off at once without tying so much as a line. They watched from the rowboat as the brig drifted deeper into fog until her lantern became a single dull star and then vanished. No ship fitting that description was ever logged entering or leaving Portland Harbor. Years later, when Gideon finally heard the old story of the Mercy of Salem, he asked to see a sketch of her figurehead, made from insurance records. He wept when it was shown to him. It was the same praying woman he had seen on the bow of the nameless brig in the fog. Gideon Marsh died in 1882. On the final night of his life, his daughter sat beside his bed and held his hand while fever took him in waves. Near dawn, he opened his eyes and stared not at her, but at the bedroom floor. Then he began to cry. When she asked what was wrong, he whispered only this, "They're knocking from underneath." Those were the last words he ever spoke. Now, if you travel the old New England coast in late autumn, when the nights come early and the sea fog creeps between the pines, you may hear old fishermen mention the story in pieces. One will say there was once a captain too proud to admit his mistake. Another will say some sailors were sealed into the walls of a ship and died crying for water. Another will tell you the Mercy of Salem still drifts from harbor to harbor looking for men foolish enough to answer a knock below deck. Most laugh after saying it, but not comfortably, and if you ask them why the story still matters after so many years, one of the older ones may lean close and tell you this, because the ocean keeps what belongs to it, but sometimes it grows tired of holding the same dead forever. Sometimes it sends them back, not whole, not alive, just near enough to be heard. And if you ever find yourself aboard an old ship after midnight, whether tied at dock or wandering through fog, and you hear crying from somewhere below, remember this tale. Do not tell yourself it is only wind in the timbers. Do not take a lantern and go searching. Do not open a cabin, because the voice on the other side sounds frightened. or young, or weak, or pitiful. And if the crying stops and becomes knocking instead, leave the ship at once. Because long years ago, in the dark off the coast of America, men died in a cabin where no light reached them and no mercy came. They clawed the wood until their nails tore away. They wept until seawater filled their mouths. They waited in the walls while the ship sailed on above them. And according to those who still know the old story, they are waiting still. On moonless nights, when fog sits low on the water and the harbor bells go quiet, the Mercy of Salem is said to appear as she did on the night she was found, mast broken, hull black, lantern burning, deck empty. She drifts close enough for a man to board, close enough for him to hear the sound from below, close enough for him to think, against all reason, that perhaps someone truly needs help in the cabin. That is how the dead call the living, not with rage, not with howls, but with sorrow, with pleading, with the sound of men who have been shut in darkness too long. And somewhere beneath those old boards, behind the wall where the sea still drips and the nails still scratch, Captain Elias Vane and the drowned crew stand listening, waiting for the latch to lift, waiting for the door to open, waiting for one more sailor to come below. And if he does, if he takes the lantern, follows the crying, and lays a hand upon the cabin door, then before the night is over, there will be another voice among them, another pair of hands scratching in the dark, another soul learning too late why the sea returns some ships long after they should have sunk. So if ever you hear a ship's hull groan in the fog and think you catch, beneath it, the sound of someone weeping, pray it is only the wind, because if it is not, then somewhere very near, beneath an old deck slick with salt and moonlight, the cabin door is waiting, and someone on the other side is crying for you to open it.